Hello, hello. This is Tony with Phillips Fishworks. Let's talk about the concept of having a separate aquarium from your main aquarium. And in this separate aquarium, we're going to try and grow small little crustaceans or small little organisms to feed your fish. So again, separate tank from the main tank with your fish. If you've got an aquarium with a bunch of fish, you want to feed them live food, that's a great idea. Realistically, if you want to create some kind of sustainable food source, some living food source, you want to grow some of these small creatures like scuds, daphnia, copepods, sea shrimp, little crustaceans, snails. If you want to grow all of that to feed your fish, to grow any kind of numbers, you're really going to have to do that in a separate aquarium. Yes, if your main aquarium with fish has just an insane dense habitat, you can grow these creatures and they can live off of that or be supplemented by that. But realistically, if you have any number of fish, it's going to be very difficult to grow these organisms in the tank in the numbers they need to be to really feed your fish completely. Yes, they will grow, they will be able to hide and find little hiding places. But the fish, while they're in there, they're going to keep those populations suppressed. So you've come to the conclusion you need a separate tank. This tank can be set up similar to your main aquarium, but there are several differences that can make it a little easier to deal with, especially while harvesting these small creatures. Let's say you're setting up a 10-gallon tank. Same rules apply for a 20-gallon or a 55, but let's set up a 10-gallon tank. You're going to put a tiny bit of dirt in the bottom. Little bit, some kind of organic potting soil would be great. Half-inch in the bottom of a 10-gallon tank. If you've got a much bigger tank, a little more dirt's okay. Don't overdo it. And it doesn't have to even be a solid layer. It can be kind of patchy. You can see the glass in the bottom. That's fine. After the soil, you're going to put some sand. I like using pool filter sand. It's usually pretty clean. You don't have to rinse it much, if any. 2 inches of pool filter sand. That's a pretty common combination. You've heard inch of soil, 2 inches of sand. I like to use less soil than an inch, especially in a 10-gallon tank, especially if you went to a 5-gallon tank. But you have a little soil in the bottom, 2 inches or so of sand. On top of that sand, I like to put a little layer of pea gravel, or even larger gravel would be best, but some kind of gravel layer. And that coarse, thick, chunky layer of gravel, that's going to provide so much habitat. And this is a half-inch, doesn't even have to fully cover the surface of the sand, but some piles of gravel would be beneficial as well. And we're going to call it a rubble tank. It's a separate tank to grow little organisms to feed your main fish tank. So we're going to want it to be 10 to 20 gallons would be best. Smaller works, but smaller volume water is harder to control the water chemistry. And if your goal is for maximum creature output, you're going to have to feed more than maybe you would if you were just going for a balanced ecosystem. And if you're feeding a lot, that water quality is going to go downhill quickly, especially if it's a gallon or 2 gallons. So you've got your thick, chunk, coarse gravel. Could be gravel piles, could be big rock piles. If you had stones that were an inch or two in diameter and you had a big pile of that, that would be good. You could also put this chunky gravel into little net pots or little baskets that are used for hydroponics that have a bunch of holes all around them, a bunch of slits, so the creatures can get in and out. And the reason you would put them in that basket is for easy removal. You could pick it up, move it into another aquarium to start another aquarium, but it doesn't hurt to have some of this material in baskets so you can move them around. Again, this is not a display tank, so you're not planting this with a bunch of expensive plants. Plants are awesome, so if you've got some extra plants you want to throw in there, that would be fine. Cuttings, clippings, hornwort, guppy grass, inexpensive plants. But keep in mind, one of the creatures you're growing in here is scuds. And the idea is to get a huge population of scuds. And we know that a huge population of scuds with no predators, those scuds can run out of food and be forced to nibble on living live plants. There is that perfect storm situation that can occur. And if you're specifically setting up a tank to grow tons and tons of scuds, it would probably be smart to not have that tank be full of expensive plants, especially if there are no predators in that tank. So other creatures that can grow with scuds and these other little micro creatures that do great, many different types of snails, copepods, seed shrimp, Daphnia, Moina. Seems like some really struggle with Moina. Daphnia seem to be a lot easier to keep going. So again, let's talk about the habitat setup. You've got your chunky rock layers, some other things that are highly beneficial. It's going to be some kind of leaf litter. A variety of leaf litter always is great. Mix it up. You don't just want one species of tree leaf, you want many different species, would be great. Little twigs, driftwood's good, but I find instead of a huge chunk of wood, do lots of little tiny sticks and twigs. They still last a long time. And they also, if you mix the leaf litter with the little twigs, it creates a lot of little gaps and spaces in between the leaves so the leaves don't kind of suppress on each other so much. Just more surface and habitat. So if you go out in the woods and you get little tiny twigs, things that have fallen, been down for a while, you're not breaking twigs off of, live branches that are green. You want something that's been on the ground a little while, a couple seasons, and these will last in your aquarium a very long time, and they look cool too. So little twigs, little sticks, small things, little pieces of bark, seed pods, acorn caps. These are the types of things that provide awesome habitat for these small creatures. And the things about botanicals like leaf litter, seed pods, little tiny sticks and twigs, that is not only a house or habitat, it is a food source. And as those botanicals become colonized by all kinds of different little microscopic organisms, then they become really prime habitat for things like baby shrimp, baby scuds, baby snails, all these little crustaceans and creatures that are so tiny. Well, their babies are even smaller. And those small little babies need a mature habitat. They need those botanicals breaking down. They need the little organisms that are growing on the botanicals, little tiny microalgae. So that habitat has to be set up a little while and mature in order to really support that thriving, growing population. And again, hornwort, something that will grow fast and isn't expensive. No reason to put delicate, expensive plants because again, you're going to be feeding this tank a little more than you would a usual tank, and the water chemistry is going to be questionable at times. Also, you're trying to grow mass amounts of scuds, which in the right situation, no predators, potentially running out of other food sources in this. You just don't want a bunch of expensive, delicate plants with a huge army of scuds that have no predators. That's kind of asking for it, really. It would be an awesome tank, especially if you have scuds in there for that filamentous algae or some kind of hair algae. They love that type of stuff. Love it. In fact, if I've got some tanks that don't have scuds here and there, and maybe they'll have some of that filamentous algae growing really prolifically in there, and I'll just reach in there, get a big wad of it, throw it in a scud tank, and I mean they're just all over it pretty quickly. And within a few days or a week, this giant mass that just seems impossible to get rid of, that's just completely gone. Now, if you have a huge mass of that hair algae or filamentous algae growing in your aquarium and you have a bunch of fish in your aquarium, putting scuds in that aquarium will not get rid of that algae because the scuds will get on the algae to eat it and then the fish will eat the scuds. So scuds are smarter than that. It's possible they could eat on it at night or something like that, but I find that probably unlikely. In a tank with a bunch of fish and a bunch of filamentous algae, that algae will help support the scud population because they will be able to hide in it. It will be a protection from the fish, but realistically, that scud population is not going to get big enough to really manage that algae because they can't, because the fish are going to keep that population low. So if there are fish in the tank, the scuds really can't get out of control and eat the plants. I've seen that over and over again. So that's kind of the tank habitat. I would also add a little bit of crushed coral or seashells or something that's going to help counteract the acidity in the water that's happening because of the botanicals breaking down, the leaf litter, the seed pods. That is actually that chemical reaction, that breaking down process uses that hardness out of the water. Also, if you're growing creatures like scuds and snails and shrimp or isopods or any of these little hard-shelled creatures, sea shrimp, copepods, they're all building their shells literally out of the water, out of the hardness in the water. They're taking those minerals out of the water and they're turning that into their bodies. So if you then are removing those creatures and feeding them to your tank, you're removing the hardness out of the water. Couple that with breaking down botanicals like leaf litter and seed pods and little twigs. As that breaks down over time, when you first set it up, everything seems fine. But maybe 3 to 6 months later, your KH and GH, your hardness, is just bottoming out. It's dropping. And then your snails are having problems building their shells. Your shrimp and scuds may not be reproducing properly. And a lot of that has to do with water hardness. So even if you're not a big fan of testing your water, I would recommend having a GH and KH test kit, maybe a pH tester. Test that hardness. See where you're at. Watch it, because if you don't have something like crushed coral in there to help buffer that, you'll watch that lower and lower and lower and lower. And eventually, if your KH is 0 and your GH is gone, low, 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 if all that's bottomed out, some animals can survive there, some animals might even thrive there. But things like neocaridina shrimp, snails, scuds, they're not going to be super happy in those types of situations because they don't have that hardness. They like a little hardness in the water. You could take aragonite sand or crushed coral, use like a pound or two for every 10 to 20 gallons. So I like leaving that number a little loose because it does take a little experimentation. Your water can be too hard, but that's usually not the issue, especially if you have a lot of leaf litter and seed pods in your system. So not having that crushed coral, and there are people use all kinds of things. So I've not experimented with everything. You hear people talk about eggshells, cuttlebone. So lots of ways to do it, but I will say it's something to look at because I had to learn that lesson the hard way, only I was learning it on a giant system with lots of fish and shrimp and snails. So you've got your substrate, you've got your botanicals, you have your plants, you've got a little crushed coral or something in there that is keeping that water hardness or your alkalinity buffered, they will say, keep the hardness up. You don't want that to bottom out. You don't necessarily need a heater. If you're in the mid 70s, that would be great. Low 80s might be okay. High 60s would probably be fine. 50s, the stuff's going to survive. Scuds and snails and shrimp, they might kind of, it's getting a little chilly. Let's not go into hyper reproduction mode. So your normal 70, 78, that's fine. Works great. But you don't necessarily need a heater, and you can still raise big populations of scuds and Daphnia in slightly cooler temperatures than your normal tropical fish tank. I've got a few tanks in my basement. They're anywhere from mid 50s to high 60s throughout the year, and I've raised thousands of scuds in 10-gallon tanks over the years. Another thing to think about is the light. Nothing special, some cheap LED lights fine, something to keep the hornwort or guppy grass alive. But also there's a day-night cycle. I like to on scud tanks, especially since I'm trying to promote algae growth. 12 plus hours on works great. Could even do 16 hours on. But 12 hours on, 12 hours off is fine, no big deal. These are all things to consider for experimentation. Everything is so radically different out there, from water chemistry to lights to material source to put the thing together originally, that the experience can be very different even if you think you're doing the exact same thing as me. So let's wrap this talk up. Lastly, and there's so much more I could say, that's the problem. These videos can get pretty long because there's so much to say and I can never fit it all in one. The last thing to consider is how long has the tank been set up? How long have your scuds or other creatures been growing in there before you start harvesting? So right off the bat, scuds, neocaridina shrimp, snails, Daphnia, these creatures can survive in extreme conditions, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be at peak reproduction. Doesn't mean they're going to be the same nutritional value for the fish you're feeding it to. And it doesn't mean you're going to have long-term success by treating these creatures like the conditions don't have to be great because they can just grow in anything. And while that may be true, it is better for maximum reproduction to have a mature tank and to have low ammonia. If you have sky high ammonia, it's going to kill your scuds. There's no way around it. And if your tank is brand new setup, a week old, 2 weeks old, even a month old, while you can put a culture of scuds or a microfauna culture in there, or a bag of bugs, leafy bugs, whatever, scud balls, that's good. That's a good step. But you must understand that that environment is not mature, not even close, meaning that sterile environment, the surfaces in that aquarium are not established with biofilm. And in that biofilm, there are all these little tiny microscopic creatures and little tiny microscopic algae. So if that aquarium is a brand new environment set up in the last couple weeks or a month, putting a culture in there is okay. Those scuds will survive and they'll do okay and they can even thrive. But keep in mind that the babies they're releasing are not being released into the most ideal environment for them to grow well. So if those, little tiny baby scuds need a little tiny microscopic environment that's thriving, full of life, little microscopic organisms and little microalgae for that little baby scud to eat, a nice little mulm layer, or, some decomposing botanicals. So if you're not putting the scud culture into a mature environment, you have to think that it's going to take some time for them to adjust. It's going to take some time for that environment to really mature and develop into something the babies will really thrive in. If a female releases 20 or 50 babies, is that environment prime, or is that environment ideal for those babies to survive? How many of those babies are going to survive and make it to reproducing age? And how long is it going to take to get there? If you set up a tank, and even if it's set up great, and you put a scud culture in there, and then a couple weeks go by and you're expecting that population to double, triple, quadruple, and you're wanting to harvest. So you start taking scuds out and feeding them to your fish. Problem is, those scuds really haven't even completed one reproduction cycle yet. And even if they had some babies or eggs within them and they release them, those are little tiny micro babies, and they're not going to be reproducing anytime soon. So this whole idea that I can throw some scuds into a tank or a system, and within a few weeks or a month or so, I'm just going to be overrun with scuds, that doesn't even happen. That's not even possible to happen. Even if you're 2-3 months in, you might have a generation or two if everything was perfect and they were comfortable and they got right to work and it wasn't this long adjustment period. So even if they are doing well, after 2 or 3 months, their population is still very small. And if you start removing big chunks of that population, they're never really going to get to that bloom or booming size. They're never going to get to that population explosion size. If you leave them go for 3 to 6 months, you're really going to start to see where their population gets big enough to where they're producing excess scuds every day or every week. And once you get to that big population, then you can harvest out 100 scuds and it not really impact the scud population. You could stick a net in there with a green bean in the net, and if within 20-30 minutes that's covered with 100 or 1,000 scuds, you know that that population's really booming. You can remove those without killing or really stunting the growth of the whole population. So you have to wait until you get to that maximum production size. You have to be patient enough to let the population grow big enough to where you can really remove a substantial amount and it not impact the growth of that population. If only a few weeks have gone by, then not much has happened as far as generational growth. If only one generation has gone by and you start harvesting to feed your fish, you're really kicking yourself in the pants, and it's not going to lead to long-term population growth or population sustainability. I really appreciate all the support. Thank you so much. Check out phillipsfishworks.com. We sell live fish food. We sell microfauna cultures, living leaf cultures. Check it out. So much to come 2025. Love you all. Bye.
Wake up, today's gonna be a good day. Wake up, today's gonna be a good day. Wake up.